I can hear you. Yes. Hi, Deirdre.
Let me just quit all of these things that are buzzing around on my computer. Welcome. Thank you for joining. But it took me a minute there to realize how to actually even add you.
We're all learning in real time all the time.
I'll wait a few minutes just because it's 2:00 on the button, and we can allow a few more people to join the call.
That's wonderful. That sounds great.
What's the suitable time to get started? Is now that time? I think probably now is that time. We're joined today. Firstly, a happy International Women's Day. It's a glorious day here in London, but it would be very remiss of me to not mention the women who are internationally struggling on a day like today, and it's a really strange time in the world, because we're at a point where we don't think things like this could happen, but we want to help in whatever way we can. And so I want to kind of give a shout out of support and solidarity to all of the international women in the Ukraine, or anyone fleeing, struggling, fighting for their life, and being forced into a situation that somebody should not be they shouldn't be in. So I just wanted to open up with that, because I think there seems something slightly distasteful about continuing on with your regular life when you know that there is so much going on in the world that is unjust. So I'll share a link. I found a really supportive website that shares an access point for funds for the Ukraine. So I'll share that after the webinar. So with that, I will get started and introduce my beautiful panelist, Eve. Really lovely to have you. Do you want to just give a little bit of a background on yourself, and then I can give a little bit of background on myself and Hertility as well, for those who don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. And Deirdre, thank you for opening with so much force and intention. I think it's so important. You know, I'll talk a lot about the work that I'm doing in the field of cervical healthcare and cervical cancer. And it's something that really drives me to do this work, to understand that the resources and access and, you know, even my outcome and my ability to do this work is predicated on having, you know, gone through my experience in a relatively calm place with plenty of resources and extraordinary care. And that's not the experience for all women. And when we think about the war in Ukraine and how much tremendous disruption and terror the women and families and civilians are living through right now, it gives me so much pause, and it also gives me so much urgency to realize that, you know, when we're able to do this work, we must. And when faced with choices about whether to act or not, we must, because the game board can change very quickly overnight. So I really appreciate your sentiments and having us both start this way today. I think it's so important. It's a hard pivot, but by way of a deeper introduction to myself, I'm Eve McDavid. I am a cervical cancer survivor and a women's health advocate. I'm also a longtime technology executive, and I'm now using my background in tech, business, and media that I have developed over a really rich career to now apply that background to fight for the type of change that I believe all women and families deserve in light of what I experienced in my own women's health crisis with a cervical cancer diagnosis that came at the end of my pregnancy with my second baby just over 2 years ago. And so, you know, it's this experience of having gone through a really acute crisis and then realizing and understanding and acknowledging that I was able to get through as I did because of the types of support, access, benefits, and resources that I had at my fingertips that are unusual for so many women in the same position. And so, we'll use this as sort of analogous case to everything that we'll talk about as it relates to women's health and fertility and our experiences as working professionals and as women, as whole people in the workplace who go through many different cycles throughout our professional lifetimes. And it's the acceptance and the balance of both of those worlds together that I believe makes us a lot more powerful and even a lot more productive as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. For those who don't know me, I am I'm actually a dual qualified lawyer in Ireland and England, and I did my master's before joining Hertility. I did my master's in medical law on the global regulation of biosciences with particular regard to gene editing and embryo research. And I then went into corporate law, and I specialized in venture capital. I am fortunate enough to have a twin sister who is in reproductive health and a specialist in genetics and CRISPR and gene editing and all of those things. And our interests, even though we went separate ways, they seem to cross forces. And I left venture capital. I left big law, as they call it, and the legal world, because I felt that it was an unsustainable. I felt that it was unsustainable and negative impact on me personally, and that was not just me, that was everyone around me, and that was why I think one of the calling forces for Hertility for me was that I wasn't the only one in a struggling situation, working 18-hour days and more, and sort of not acknowledging that there are other things in life, and that your health can suffer, and there are impacts on your health. And so Hertility is a women's health healthcare company, and it's at the crux of this is advanced digital diagnostics, getting women help earlier, getting diagnostics sooner, and at present we can diagnose 9 of the most common benign female gynecological pathologies. And for the breadth of work that Hertility does, its central focus is in research, is in changing the status quo for women, so that women who have been in your situation, you had the fortunate ability to have access to an OBGYN, a specialist in reproductive health. And that's one of the main focus details and differences between the UK and the US, is that women tend to have an OBGYN. They tend to have an obstetrician gynecologist to help and to assess, particularly in pregnancy. And it isn't the case for women here. So one of the things about that we're trying to change is that the attitude towards your reproductive health here is almost that it's and I hate the word taboo, but it's a taboo thing, and that it's your periods and it's unrelated to everything else. And I think what we're trying to pioneer is that, it isn't just about this monthly cycle, it's about your entire well-being, and that your hormones and your mental health cross over to one another, and your endocrine system is built into it, and that there is an extremely important facet in really knowing what your reproductive health is doing. And you've learned firsthand that having access to care has life-changing and indeed life-saving impacts. So I'd like to sort of dig into that a little bit deeper, and just sort of, I guess, get to grips with where you felt that the access to care that you've had could be changed for other people, and particularly in a maybe less invasive environment. If you just give some background and information on your journey to discovering your cervical cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the distinctions between what you described in the UK health system and the United States health system are really important. And before our conversations, even I didn't realize how disparate the systems are. And, I'm someone who is spending a lot of time now exploring the systems and understanding the details and nuances to how women go through their lifetimes accessing care throughout these various different stages that we find ourselves in, whether that may be, when we're thinking about becoming pregnant, when we're going through pregnancy, when we're, experiencing the aftermath and postpartum, and, sort of the, what comes next for all of us. And of course, that is just a very small segment of our life. There are many other stages. And as you just mentioned, there are many different cycles, many different experiences where our hormones and everything that makes up a woman's body is, operating in the background, and is part of us, being alive every day, and waking up and being here, and living our lives. So, I'll share with you a little bit more about the discovery of my diagnosis, and sort of how it really, well, it in many ways both stopped me in my tracks, and then also became an enormous transformative experience, where there's a phrase, post-traumatic growth, where, in these moments of crisis and trauma, they somehow, some way become these extraordinary opportunities when we're lucky enough to make it through, and begin to understand the hindsight, and I guess really the purpose of all of it. So I was at the end of my pregnancy, and in the United States, in the care system in which I was part of, it's very common at the end of the pregnancy, in the last month or so, for a woman to visit her OBGYN and have a sort of like a weekly checkup of how close are you to getting ready to deliver this baby. And there is a pelvic exam that's part of that checkup. And so with my son, I was almost 36 weeks. I was, just before that mark, and I'd gone into my provider, and it also coincided with what would be my last day at work before my maternity leave began. So, my mind was elsewhere. my mind was, intent on wrapping up my work. I was really at a real peak in my career at that moment, wrapping up my work, setting it into the capable hands of the folks on my team who would be stewarding the business over the course of the next 6 months. And, I was hoping to go home and start to enjoy this idea that, we'd be, building as a new family of 4. I also have a little girl, my son's older sister, and she was 2.5 at the time. And, like the best laid plans, everything went very differently from what I expected. I was in the middle of my pelvic exam, and my doctor let me know that my cervix felt irregular. And I have had many pelvic exams in my lifetime, and I had never heard the phrase irregular used. And that to me was like a 5-alarm fire. I was like, that sounds like a medical term. That sounds like a term that you don't use when everything is right on track. These were the things that were going through my mind at that time. And it's because things were not on track. I had a 7-centimeter tumor that would, later be identified as a stage 2B cervical cancer diagnosis. And what was really extraordinary was that it had grown really rapidly during my pregnancy, and which is relatively unusual for cervical cancer diagnoses, although it is not unheard of. And the more that I learn about this field, the more that I understand that pregnancy is actually a really interesting time for a condition like cervical cancer to grow and to grow undetected, because there's a lot of other activity that's going on in the pelvis at the same time. So, when we think about access to care, when we think about, support and resources, my physician was able to get me into scans, into an oncology appointment and then make a plan for my son's early delivery within 72 hours. And, you know, again, as we think about like how my story stacks to the experience of all women who go through a diagnosis like this, I think of every single touch point as a just-in-time miracle and really an aberration. It's not the way so many women go through this. I had no delays in care, no compromises. Everything was treated like a crisis with the urgency and intention and focus that really was required to save my life. And that's what they did. You know, I'm here, I'm in remission. I reached remission about a year ago, and my son is 2 years old, and we are a happy family of 4. We woke up today all together, and 2 years ago that was not a foregone conclusion, and we remember that every day. You know, we understand how you know, divergent these two paths really could have been if there'd been any sort of miss or misstep. And that was not my experience. And so, you know, I feel that because I, you know, went through the unimaginable and everything went the way it had to go, everything went right. Now it's my turn to help other women and families through this, to help them prevent these experiences, to prevent these diagnoses, and in the unfortunate case that they do end up developing a cervical cancer diagnosis, to make that care, that treatment, and that recovery so much better than the experience women go through today.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's harrowing to think just how close you can get to something that is catastrophic and devastating. And had you not been going through what was a routine examination, you know, you just that would have been missed. And it's one of the things that we see time and time again is that there's a symptom dismissal, and that there is, I mean, had you not had a physical examination where they could feel that there was an irregularity, you know, that could easily have been missed. Had you not been pregnant at the time, it could have been, because so often we see that just symptoms are ignored, and symptom dismissal is something that we do. It's not necessarily something just that doctors do, because we're taught to accept that pain is part of being a woman, that pain is part of having periods, and it's really, really important to reassess. One of the things that we do at Hertility is we really encourage people to listen to their own bodies. One thing that we when we started the company, we said we would break down into categories of who would want this product, who would want to test their hormones, who would want to test their hormone fertility, and we mostly assumed that it was the actively trying, or those who were looking to conceive in sometime soon. And in actual fact, the preponderance of people were those who had some form of symptom, or something that they just wanted to know, and that something's not quite right. There's a category that you can choose to say, this is why I'm doing this. Something's not right. In 80 or 90% of the people who selected that something wasn't right, they didn't know, they had no diagnosis, they just knew something wasn't right. They had a previously undiagnosed reproductive health condition. And so listening as sort of an innate voice, listening to ourselves and saying, you know what, something doesn't feel right, I need to get this checked out, I think is one of the biggest calls to action that we can give other women, and to say, don't ignore your symptoms, don't ignore the pain. But for you, you know, it's so easy to miss with something like pregnancy, because if there was pain, if there was, you know, other symptoms, and if look at your reproductive health and menstrual cycle is seen as one of the vital signs now, along with your pulse, and any of the symptoms you could have had would have been just bunged into, that's just pregnancy. You know, you're supposed to feel kind of crappy. So you really are
very normal. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, like Deirdre, you make such an important point there. You know, cervical cancer is caused, the majority of cervical cancers are caused by persistent high-risk HPV infections, human papillomavirus infections, a very, very common sexually transmitted infection. And something that, you use the word taboo. I don't know. It's not a great word, but is there a better word? It's like, it's the word, right? The way that we feel about something that we shouldn't have shame and stigma around. And think about how different this experience had been if I had felt confident enough to say, okay, I have a high risk HPV strain. I'm about to become pregnant. What do I need to be paying attention to during my pregnancy such that we track this and any irregularities that may arise, knowing that pregnancy is a time when, things can go a little bit haywire. How much agency does the woman now have to say, I can talk about this, I can ask questions about this, I can get the right information about this. And when these symptoms that I'm already informed about arise, I have a plan that I can work on with my provider to manage this. And so we take that intuition, that, that gut instinct that is very important. That's a very important trait of being human. And for us to be able to trust in our bodies, something is not right. Then you pair that with information and a public dialogue around it, making it easy for us to talk about. We don't have those same crises at the same level, right? There's a level of preparedness that we can bring into these situations, and being prepared creates a sense of agency, and that goes a very, very long way in our abilities to advocate for ourselves and to ask for and then receive the care that we need and that we deserve.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point about not being prepared because you didn't want to actually make a big deal about it. You knew something inherent about your body and your physiology and your chemical makeup, and yet you felt that that wasn't something you could share. And I think that's for me that one of the reasons why I think having something that you can do at home is so important, and that's why I'm really happy that we're moving towards a world of at-home testing and digital diagnostics, because there isn't that layer of shame or that layer of discomfort in and around asking questions. I have found it time and time again, and anyone will tell you I'm as vociferous and vocal and able to shout and scream and say what I like and not wince or scream about it. Yet I found even there were situations in the delivery of my two children that I didn't want to say anything. I felt uncomfortable mentioning something, or there was a pain, or there was all natural bodily functions. And yet I found when I was faced with a man, a male obstetrician in front of me, I turned into someone that I didn't recognize myself. And so I think that we can be advocates for being loud and voicing concerns and standing up for your reproductive rights, as we say, but it's a very, very different situation, I think, sometimes when you're actually confronted with a person who asks you a very personal question. And so I think it will take a while before we get to the point where we're all very comfortable speaking around our health in such an intimate way, without it actually being an intimate thing. It should be just a natural thing that we can discuss and speak about freely. Speaking about it freely as well, it's not just in your personal life and been confronted with a doctor, it's also in the workplace when you consider that now we're working remotely, but when we're in a physical, mostly working remotely, when you're in a physical workplace and you have something going on in the background, how did you find that I guess the timing of you finishing work? I mean, from an organizational point of view, I know that will have been one less thing on your if you're anything like me, you'd be panicking about I panicked about my to do before I'm due list for a really long time, which meant that I worked extremely hard just before having a baby, and that was the thing that preoccupied my mind. But did you feel like you could speak to work? Did you feel that you could talk to the right people within your organization at that point, or was it such that the timing was that you were on maternity leave, so you didn't feel the need to reach out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I had such an interesting and unique experience, but I lived through it, working for Google, where, it's well known that from an employment and benefit standpoint, this is, really the company that leads the way and offers the gold standard in benefits and resources to its employees. And so, my experience was like the best way through, because of everything that is set up to take care of employees when they go through something like this. And I've often said in my time since that, we don't need to have had cancer to have had a crisis over these last 2 years during the pandemic. I mean, we all have gone through our own various life events, all of which, we experience a varying degree of intensity around. And so to do so with the backdrop of an employer that, in my mind, offers two really important baskets. There's the access to the benefits and the resources, the healthcare, et cetera. And then there's the access to the time.
Yeah.
And those are two really important factors here, because in my experience, there was the maternal health needs and the acute treatment of a cancer diagnosis. And that all happened in, a relatively short window.
Yeah.
We're talking about almost, like a quarter, when you think about it from a business sense. Right. It was a very productive quarter. As I say, it was my most successful quarter to date. But the fallout from so much all at once, it's so many life events on top of each other, so many crises. And then we had the pandemic on top of it, going through this in New York City. So all of a sudden, like logistically and geographically, our surroundings were different in the aftermath of this. And you find yourself reeling from the physical and mental health fallouts that are very common in maternal health and very common in cancer care. And so you put the two together, and I was really in this perfect storm of a tremendous need state. And while it took me a long time to share my diagnosis publicly, I did not share broadly that I had cervical cancer until about, it was really a year after my treatment wound down. I mean, I had shared, personally and among, very close friends and family, but I didn't share it broadly because of this stigma that I felt around its connection to HPV, which is, a whole separate conversation. But there was so much reckoning with who I was and who I would be in the aftermath of this. And the only thing that I knew was that I was not able to also be a professional in the world and keep up with that identity that had been such a critical part of my life for the previous decade plus. I knew that this was a point in time where I had to really retreat. I had to focus on myself and my healing. And I had to learn to be a person again. These experiences, they blow us apart and they challenge our identities. And, we struggle with who we are and what we then do next. And for me, because of the support, because of the time, because of the access to extensive benefits, we talked about the healthcare benefits. There are also extensive mental health resources as well that I took advantage of. This became a point in time where I experienced post-traumatic growth, where I all of a sudden understood that this incredible training that I'd had in private and public industry for the last 15 years could now be activated to make a difference and contribution for women and families who, shouldn't have to go through something like I did. And it was only because I had this space and time to recover that I could really, find myself again and really determine how how do I want to live now that I get this chance to do it again? And what will be the professional expression of my work in the world? And how will that balance with my life as I am myself at home with myself, my husband, my children? Those are big questions that I had never really addressed before.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, you don't need cancer to face these. There are, you know, many points as a woman professionally where we actually become stronger when we're well supported in the workforce.
Yeah.
I think of, you know, a longtime mentor of me who told me I was, you know, getting ready to go out on maternity leave with my first baby, my daughter. And I was so worried about, you know, like, who would I be, you know, would I be able to handle the clip and the pace and the intensity, and, you know, like, what would happen? I had so much anxiety about, uh, you know, taking a leave away from this and not being sure of what the future looked like. And she said to me, she said, you know, we cannot hire this way, but I wouldn't be opposed to having an entire team of working moms. They're the hardest working people in the workforce. You know, we come in every day, we have focus, we have intention, we're productive. And then when we're done with the day, we move on and we can live the rest of our lives. And so, you know, there's a real importance in the message of, we can be both.
Yeah.
And in order for us to be our best, you know, we have to acknowledge at work that we are these whole people. We are these people who are comprised of all sorts of different experiences and challenges. And that doesn't, it's not to the detriment of our work. It's actually for the betterment of the collaborative nature of, you know, what we're really able to do together in the workplace.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's funny though that the tone of all of this is this break the bias, and the bias around how we are perceived as women, as mothers, as pregnant people. It's one of those things that I have to say an admission of my own guilt on being biased before I'd become pregnant, or before I'd had babies. And I and it was before COVID, so it was a different world, and I was very much in the corporate world. And my twin sister and co-founder had a baby, and she, you know, there was occasions where she would, through dented necessity, bring her baby on calls. And, you know, I was as harsh as anyone. I just did not think that was appropriate, not the right forum. It wasn't acceptable. It was, and it's funny how, you know, society has moved on from this sort of belief that you are your corporate self, or you are your work self, and you are not anyone else when you're in work. And there's society and expectations have changed now, where we had our call together where we 3 out of 4 people on the call had a baby on their lap, and it was this acknowledgement that, you know what, we are a better person when we can actually facilitate our own lives. And I completely agree with you that you learn to become organized in a way that you simply have to, because it's multitasking, it's organization, it's time prioritization, and it's knowing that you may only get 15 minutes, and that 15-minute window is got to be really reproductive. So I think we're at Hertility, we're almost, I think, 98% women, which is bordering on not diverse at all, because we are propagating being a very diverse team. With we see an awful lot of women on our team, and actually having a family, sustaining that life. I think that's, as a workplace benefit for me, that there should be a greater emphasis on supporting women to have a family, if should they choose. Now, a lot of people don't want to, but it shouldn't be that there's a hindrance. It shouldn't be that there is a barrier because of how they're going to be perceived, because of some bias where you felt you might be perceived as, but you also may become a different person. And before you have a family, you don't know what it's going to be like. You don't know how hard it's going to be, how many sleepless nights you're going to have, how you're going to cope to do your work, to be yourself. And so it's one of the things that I feel really, really strongly about, is that we, in the workplace in particular, we should support people's decisions to say, you know, this isn't an either or. You don't have to have a family or have a successful career. You can and you should be able to do both. And those in your companies should be able to support that in ways that go beyond benefits. And I'm a big advocate for benefits in the sense that, you know, I think I'm a true believer that the true benefits for a woman in working places, that they get access to reproductive health tracking, which is what we do. And rather than saying, you know what, we'll pay for something when it goes wrong, we'll get you to put those eggs on ice, so that you can work through your most fertile years. I'm actually I think the truest gift that you can give a woman is support through her life cycle, and saying to her, not we'll pay for your IVF when you really struggle to conceive, because that sounds like an instant fix. You know what, it's fine. Without delving into the mental, psychological, financial, emotional burden that can happen, and the physiological effect of that. So I think having regular checks, regular tracking of your reproductive health, that to me is a far more sensible way of assessing whether or not you would need IVF, is if you knew where your ovarian reserve was. And I think all women tend to kind of, you balance it out. Is this the right time in my career to have a baby? Is this I can't afford to get pregnant right now. I need to do all these other things. I've got 4 more steps on that ladder to climb. And you know, being faced with a situation such as the one you were in, where, you know, no one has time to have anything. No one has time to do, if we put everything on an organizational structure, there's no good time to do anything. I think having your experience, recognizing that something can change, like you say, overnight. Something fundamental can change, and you have to be able to prepare yourself for that. You have to be able to say, right, how am I going to cope? How am I going to now support myself, my family, irrespective of work? So that there's just so much more to it than, I guess, the career ladder, or the where are you at in life. It's knowing that you should have to prepare yourself for any eventuality.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And I think there's such an interesting phenomena around, again, all these life stages that we go through that also happen to intersect with who we are and how we present at work. And you know, we had a chance to talk about this in our preparation. There was an article this weekend in the New York Times in the business section about the relief that women who have been pregnant during the pandemic, who are fortunate enough to be working from home and, you know, conducting their meetings on Zoom. They're so much happier because they don't have to talk about being pregnant at work and wonder. It's not that they're happier not disclosing it. They're happier removing the instant judgment and the bias that comes by announcing your pregnancy, by being visibly pregnant at work, by being visibly uncomfortable being pregnant at work, right? Like those were all, you know, expressions that women who are quoted in the article shared. And I thought about this, and at one point I was crushed because I was like, I didn't even realize that, you know, those are all the layers that are up against you as a pregnant woman in the workforce. But then also this hope and optimism that we have this incredible experiment of what happens when pregnancy is not part of the dialogue, and what happens to the health and the happiness of women. And that relief goes a long way. The other point that I'll make here is that, you know, we tend to, as you mentioned, you know, that, you know, something like IVF may be like a solution that we go to, and we have this need state, so we go there, okay, we have this option. The better that we are able to accept that we're all on a continuum here. You know, this is not, you know, just the point in my life where I'm pregnant and this is the time that I do this, but this is the experience that I'm in right now, and it is temporary. And once I'm through my pregnancy, then I'm on another continuum of what does it look like to rearrange my life and reprioritize and determine how and with whom I'm spending my time, and how does that change over time. And so I think like what we're missing in the workplace is this acknowledgement that we are humans and we all go through our lives in different ways. And one of the ways is this intersection with work, but it's not the only intersection. And the more that we sort of share between these worlds that we sit in all the time, I think the better supported, the easier it is for women to have these conversations, and the easier it is for us to, raise our hands, say, I need help, I need support, resources, benefits, time, whatever it may be, because there's an acknowledgement that this is something very natural and human that women go through their lifetimes, rather than, oh, here's a problem, here's a solution, okay, solved, now are you ready to work again? It just doesn't work like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And would you, I mean, you, in your experience, you've gone through something which no one should go through, and you've come out the other side, thankfully, and you're all the stronger for it, and now you've become a women's health advocate. You've used the negative to break through and find some positive, and to try and share what your experience was to better experiences for other. Just tell me a little bit more about the things that you're doing in that space to try and make change for other women so that they don't have to go through this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we think about the theme of International Women's Day is break the bias. That is really what I grappled with in my decision to become a women's health advocate and to publicly do this work. When I was first diagnosed, I did what a lot of us do, which is turn to the internet and start searching for information and insight and hope and stories, anything to understand what the future, a few steps ahead of me may look. And I was crestfallen to see that the majority of the way and the tone in which women talk about cervical health care is negative. It is so shrouded in the stigma and shame. And I thought, well, that's exactly how I feel personally and professionally as a marketer and someone in business. I thought, well, if everyone who goes through this is saying the same thing, then this is what we'd call an insight, right? This is something that is really important for me to pay attention to. So I looked at the background I had, before all of this at Google. I was a very public person. I'm someone who presented on stages, very comfortable, one-on-one with executives in a boardroom. And I thought, well, I've done this. I've spoken publicly for so much of my career. I just have never talked about myself, but what would it look like if I made this information that is so hard to talk about sound and feel a little bit easier? And when it comes to the weight of a bias or a shame in something like this, the best antidote is being vocal. The best thing that I could do was use my voice. I did my research. I looked through my professional network. I looked to see whether women's leaders in the United States were talking about cervical healthcare publicly, how they were talking about annual visits, going to providers, seeing your gynecologist, having pap tests, getting the HPV vaccine. It's not that there was silence, but there wasn't much of it. And I couldn't point to a women's leader who really, made it her platform to say women's health, especially in this capacity, cervical health care being such an important cornerstone of women's health care, that was her message. And so I said, okay, I can do that. And, it wasn't so easy. Like, it takes a lot of normalizing and talking to myself in the mirror to go on social media or to sit on a panel and talk about a sexually transmitted infection. But I do it because I know what the cost of not doing it is, right? How much longer do we have to wait for another woman to survive this and to start talking? And I'm not the first one to do this. I'm like, right, you've been working in this field for some time. I'm joining a lot of women and advocates and allies who've been doing this for some time. And, I saw myself in this world, and I saw that my voice and my story was important, and that, I could then use it to fight for change. The other thing that I'm doing.
It's really brave.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's really it's easier to have the sort of corporate veil on, or your work face on, but then when you have to talk about yourself or a personal experience, and we've both shared pretty dark and pretty harrowing experiences that we've had, and even, you know, we discussed it ourselves, were we actually even comfortable bringing them up? It's something that you can, unless everyone starts to speak up, everyone is still silenced, and the negative experiences are perpetuated. And I think so. It's really brave that you've come forward as a women's health advocate, and I it couldn't be at a more powerful and important time, because I think there is a younger generation who are far more comfortable and open about cervical mucus or periods, and, you know, sharing pictures and things like that, even a step beyond the sort of freedom of expression that we even have. And I think that's the point where we need to get to, is normalizing the conversation. You know, I guess the analogy I use and that I would like people to get to is that, you know, we want to be sort of the 10,000 steps of reproductive health tracking. You know, before, no one knew I quite got to this, you need to get to 10,000 steps a day, but it was an advertising campaign, and next thing you know, you have everyone through a very short passage of time, people accepting that this is a standard that you need to get to. I know I need, you know, my 77-year-old dad saying I need to do my 10,000 steps today, and I think that's where we need to get to with women's health. That we need to say, well, I know what my LH is, or my FSH, or or where my hormones are. I know where my ovarian reserve is. I know, because I'm tracking it. I'm, instead of like my steps and my sleep and how many hours of REM I had, I know what my reproductive health is looking like, because that isn't, it isn't just my reproductive health, it's all of my health. And it's something that will dictate how I feel and how I work and how I express myself. And so that kind of waking up and paying attention to ourselves and to our bodies is something that is really important for our lives, for our health, and for our, I guess, to get the best output from our day to day, whether that's in work or not.
That's absolutely right. And the work that we're doing illuminates a new and growing field of medicine that will be so important for the future generation, right? The work that we do to break down the level of discomfort that we have about talking about these things in the workplace, right? That's a signal that we may not be sitting in an environment that is actually that conducive to who we want to be professionally and what we want to work on. And I think about, you know, all the work that I see possible in this field, you know, where I sit, and I think about the work that you do at Hertility, where, you know, you're talking about, again, the normalizing of very normal human functions and making it easier to understand. What does that information and education do to a young woman who is 12 or 13 years old trying to figure out, you know, oh my goodness, my body is changing, and this is just the beginning of me being a woman. You know, how different is her life, her choices, where she spends her time, what she works on, what she majors in, because she sees a better future that she can be part of. It's an incredible message. And I think of my daughter and you know, what I hope she will grow up with, and it will be a very different experience than what we grew up with, which was already a much improved experience than what previous generations had.
Yeah, absolutely. And an acknowledgement that you know, you talk about a change. Well, we're constantly in a state of change. This is the reason why women's health is so under researched, is that we have an Easter cycle. And so to try and do research on, we're awful for controls, because our hormones will change depending on the hour, not time of day or time of month. And it's something that they're changing throughout our reproductive life cycle, all the way through perimenopause and menopause. And that's one of the big things we're also seeing in the workplace, is that there is a need to have this awareness that you may not be your whole self one day. You may not be, you might be putting on a brave face, but you could be going through symptoms or pain or something that really, really affects your ability to even exist. And that's one of the things that's really refreshing, is that we're starting to see a lot more voices in and around why it is that we're going through these things, or what it is that's changing in our bodies, and how it is that we can support those around us. And I think generally, just in my mind, there's loads of policies you can put in place. There's loads of pieces of paper that you can say, hey, we're friendly to the menopausal woman. But I've done a lot of digging into this. When you actually look at what the policies are, I think it just distills down to like, just be nice, be supportive,
Yeah.
be aware that someone is going through something that you may not understand and they may not understand. And I think that when it all comes down to it, having an organization that is just, is supportive of someone's life outside of work, but also acknowledges that someone mightn't be their best on any given day. I think in as much as anything, that's the thing, in a genuine way that organizations need to do. Obviously,
Yeah.
I would think that they need to go full support, and all I'd love if all businesses had Hertility and everyone was regularly tracking their reproductive health, so that they could signpost and see any diagnostic or get earlier diagnostics into reproductive health conditions. But I also think that when it comes down to it, if a company just recognize that we're all human and that we are going through various different cycles, and just being supportive of that, that's number one fundamental thing for me. I don't know if you'd agree, or if there's any one standout policy or thing that you've seen in your career that you would advocate.
Yeah, well, I'll share two things actually there that really are very salient for me. The first is that my entire career, particularly in technology, I've been told at work that the only thing constant is change. And so why are we not able to apply that to the humans who work in the workforce as well, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like we talk about, women's health having this difficult control set. Well, our control is a cycle. Our control is change. And the acknowledgement of that, I think is really important. The other thing that I'll say too is that, we're building companies for the long run here, right? No business starts out being like, I'm going to be in business for 18 months and that's going to be a great run. And then, like we move on, right? When we build a company, we're building something to last. And so it's to the benefit of an employer to consider longitudinal research around what happens when we offer the benefits that are important to the populations who are represented in our workforce, when we create the spaces for transparent dialogue, and then we make the time available that's necessary, particularly in these experiences that they're like, it's grief and it's joy, right? Like when I think about pregnancy and I think about, my own experiences conceiving and having children, there were incredible periods of joy. And then there were incredible periods of strife and trauma and grief. And it's a whole package together. And so the time aspect of that, knowing that an employee can pull on a basket of leave and say, you know what, this week is not a week where I'm available, but here's a whole team who represents the body of work that I also sit in, and they're going to be just fine to do it. That's language that, we are just now, I think, becoming more comfortable expressing. And the more of us who do it at the individual level inside of a company, I think that the effect, the force of that really can make a difference. And then again, from an employer standpoint, it's relatively easy to experiment with what happens when I add these benefits, when I think about the culture and whether people feel safe enough here to express themselves and to ask for help when they need it. Those are relatively easy test cases to experiment within. And there's also a tremendous amount of data that shows when you do these things, the health and the productivity and the stability of the workforce improves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just conscious that we've got 5 minutes to go, so we can open up to some questions that we've received. So let me just grab the questions. So what advice would you give fellow females and males approaching a similar situation on their health journey in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing that I would say is you have to reorient your mind to take care of yourself. When we are part of a corporate culture, we see ourselves and our identities as, oftentimes it's like one and the same. And so when we go through these crises, there's a big pull between how do I take care of myself and how do I let myself feel the guilt of not being there or missing out on the work that, is important to me also. And during these times of crisis, you really can't do two things at once. At least I couldn't, I knew that the only way that I could manage was to focus. So the first thing is, to get comfortable with the idea of self-preservation. The second thing that I would say is to find someone that you trust who can understand your experience and support you both as a person and professionally. This may be your manager. This may be someone who is in a position of authority at your company where they are in a position to help and help you navigate internally at the company while you are now sort of hanging on the outside and focusing on your own journey through this. And then the third thing that I would say is to do the same thing with a partner in HR. I've recently been coaching a woman who unfortunately is going through a crisis right now. And I was able to say from my own experience, okay, this is the person in HR who's going to be a really great partner to you. She may not be the person you're assigned to, but pull this woman in because she has the experience of coaching me through this, and she'll be able to offer that person more. So I think it's really about how we identify these people and processes within the company that are going to be able to support us. But it's difficult. It's hard. And so, if you feel that way going through it, know that that's normal, and know also that, you're an employee, which means you are inherently valuable to the company. And so there will be systems and processes and people in place to support you through. Find those who, you feel most comfortable with. Use the benefits, use the time, take everything that you need, and know that you will return to your career and your body of work when you are ready and healthy to do so. And there's no time limit on that, right? Like, all that matters is that you get through it. And then once you come up for air, you can start to, work your way back. And that is a very reasonable and well understood process that people in any type of crisis go through.
Completely agree. You're absolutely right. There's a few other questions which actually I feel like you've already covered those. So I think for those who asked a couple of other questions, I was reading through them and you've covered them over in that. We'll quickly just do one more.
Okay, great.
What would you advise senior leaders, managers, and supportive bodies such as HR to ensure they support employees facing women's health issues? I think again you kind of covered this, but is there anything specific you would add to that?
Yeah, I'll go very quickly and just say that, it starts with a culture of psychological safety. Before we even think about the benefits and resources, do we have a culture where women feel comfortable expressing themselves and asking for help? Yep. And that's really the foundation. And then everything then builds on that, and is it's a benefit and a bonus, but again, it works both ways. It's good for the company and it's good for the individual.
Yeah. I think you've nailed it there, really. I think if you have the right environment, the right people, and the right people you can share it with, then everything else is secondary. You can have a policy in place, but unless you can have a conversation with someone, it's redundant being on a piece of paper. So I think you really nailed that there. So we're 1 minute to go, so we'll look to wrap up there. But Eve, thank you so much for joining. It's been absolutely breathtaking to get to know you and to hear your story, and to know that you're looking to pioneer change in the same way that we're looking to pioneer change, and to help people, you know, get to diagnostics sooner and get help and be recognized as going through things. And I think your voice is outstanding, and I appreciate everything you're doing in this space, and I'm so glad you joined us to shout loudly about this.
Well, Deirdre, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to have this conversation. And I agree with you. You know, we are like-minded, and we are fighting for change and fighting for women's rights, and for, you know, creating a better version of the world, both professionally and personally, that we all want to live in. And I think there's, you know, no more worthy effort and cause than that.
Couldn't agree more. We'll get there. We'll do it.
Yes, we will, together.
Okay, well, thank you. And exactly. And thank you to everyone who joined. There'll be extra links on, like I said, about the Ukrainian appeal afterwards.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.